Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 85. Natasha. The point of this particular mission was to get in, get information, and get out undetected. Natasha had done such things in the past. They'd always been a great deal of, well, something close to fun, if she were to ever admit to such a thing. They were also extremely challenging, which was part of the fun, because getting around security systems and guards undetected was varying levels of difficult. With Jarvis assisting, this mission promised to be somewhat less exciting on the electronics front, which was not to say that Natasha would have no worries that direction. Jarvis didn't have access to or control over everything in the Hydra base. To make up for the lessened excitement on the electronics front, the base was under a legitimate business building teeming with people. Natasha had no idea how Hydra had arranged it, but their base was in a sub-basement that the people working in the building overhead seemed to be entirely unaware existed. At least only those Jarvis had identified as Hydra went anywhere near the base. To be fair, the original building was older, dating from right around when Steve had been born. So it was entirely possible the current owners truly had no idea what they had under their building. Natasha waited until 2 in the morning, far enough past the evening shift change that the guards in the base would have let their guard down and perhaps even begun to get sleepy if they were any sort of inept. 2, if this went spectacularly pear-shaped, there were fewer innocent civilians to get caught in the crossfire. At that hour of the night, the office building proper was deserted. Natasha had always included plans for if a mission went pear-shaped. But she learned after Budapest to make plans for if things went ridiculously pear-shaped. There were more reasons than fear and distrust that a great many agents and operatives refused to have anything to do with her and Clint. The regularity with which their missions went pear-shaped in spectacularly unpredictable ways was one of them. But the fact that 2 of them always somehow managed to complete the missions was the other. The ones who couldn't handle the first generally got ulcers over the second. Natasha didn't bother going through the building. That was useless. There was only the one access to the base there, and that was the front door, as it were. The likelihood of there being security features Jarvis couldn't control or guard on patrol at that point was extremely high. Now, for this, Natasha used the maze of tunnels under the city. Sewer lines, old subway tunnels, maintenance tunnels of all sorts crisscrossed underneath the city and made it possible, if you were careful and knew what you were doing, to get practically anywhere without too much trouble and without being seen. Better still, the base was bound to have one or more back doors into that system of tunnels. Jarvis hadn't found one in the blueprints he'd been able to find, but there would be one. It took her an hour of hunting to find a suspiciously new-looking grating blocking a section of tunnel locked up with chains. There were no cameras in evidence. Getting to the lock holding the chains was awkward, as the lock was inside the grating. It made picking it a lot more challenging, but she managed it. Not her best time, but swift enough. She was careful to close the grate and drape the chain back the way it had been, putting the padlock in place, but not closing it. It would be enough to fool all but a close inspection, and would save her the trouble of having to repick the lock if she had to leave in a hurry. A short, careful trip down the tunnel led her to the sort of door she associated with nuclear fallout shelters. Big, bulky, and heavy. Also probably very noisy. And locked from the inside. Damn. Looked like she'd have to go in the front door after all. There was no lock to pick here. She nearly had a heart attack when the door popped open, silently, a few millimeters. It wasn't until she got inside that she realized what had happened. The door on the inside was controlled electronically. On the little keypad that normally only displayed the numbers you input to open the lock was a brief message. Happy to help. Jay. Natasha gave a pleased nod. Jarvis might not have known to look for it just from the blueprints, but he'd evidently traced it after tracking her and realized she'd stopped moving for some reason. The room the escape hatch was in was dusty and musty, with disuse, a pile of cardboard boxes moldering in one corner. She walked over to check them out. They weren't likely to have anything of import in them if they'd been more or less forgotten in here, but it went against the grain not to check. The next door was a lot simpler to deal with. It, like all the other internal doors, was electronically controlled, and it popped open a few millimeters as she approached. She opened it just enough to be able to hear clearly and listened for anyone approaching. Nothing. A quick, guarded peek around the corner showed her 2 or 3 cameras in the corridor beyond, all of which glitched briefly before resuming their regular sweeps. Natasha slipped out into the hallway and made her way carefully towards the labs and the computers therein, the ones Jarvis couldn't tap into because they were totally cut off from the internet. She didn't see anyone for the first 2 corridors, but finally her luck ran out in the form of one of the wandering security personnel. She quickly ducked back the way she'd come. She'd passed a few doors on the way, supply closets and disused rooms. It was easy enough to slip into one and duck out of sight. The one she'd picked proved to be completely empty, not even any built-in shelves or what have you remaining, and covered in nearly an inch of dust. The urge to kick the guy's ass was there, but if she did, she'd have the rest of the security on her in next to no time, if she did not want them alerted to the fact that someone was onto them. They might suspect, perhaps, with the Avengers having Barnes in their clutches, but that was a might. It depended entirely on whether or not Barnes had ever been exposed to proof that the Red Room was in fact a Hydra operation, and on how fast they thought Barnes would give up that information if he had it. Other than that, though, there was no proof out in plain sight that Hydra still existed. Once the guard had returned in the direction he'd come from, Natasha reemerged, being careful to make sure none of the dust came out with her to leave a telltale trail behind her. The stupid guard hadn't even walked down the corridor, just stopped at the corner and looked down the rest of the corridor. Even if this corridor hadn't been used in decades, such inattention was beyond stupid. Of course, the rest of the trip couldn't be that easy. She walked down the corridor the guard had stuck to, and at the next corner came to a much more used section, the lighting brighter and the floors and walls cleaner than in the disused corridor, which wasn't saying much, as there still weren't any people. Not until the last door before the next corner, the first of the labs she needed to get information from. A quick peek inside provided her with the information that the 3 scientists scheduled to be in here were all in the lab, which was good. Having to deal with one coming in from a bathroom and or snack break would have been tricky. As it was too easy to sneak into the room unobserved. Scientists, let them get buried in their work and a nuclear bomb could go off and they'd never notice. This she knew for fact. There were scientists in S.H.I.E.L.D. who'd been on the helicarrier who hadn't realized there'd been an invasion until the helicarrier had come under attack. This despite the fact that helicarrier had been put on a war footing, which had meant a lot more activity than the norm. She pulled 3 of the needles with sleeping agents out of their hiding places. With a bit of luck, she'd be able to dose all 3, and none of them would realize they'd been dosed. The sleeping agent would take hold fast and had the beneficial side effect of scrambling or erasing about 10 minutes of memory prior to its application. They'd assumed they fell asleep over their consoles if she did this right. That lab goes without a hitch. The scientists are actually already half asleep, only going through whatever they were working on in a very desultory fashion. She was able to knock them out and download the information onto the thumb drives without a problem. The second lab, located on the second floor, was a repeat of the first in virtually all details. 3 scientists, half asleep already at this hour, and no problems dosing them and getting the information. The third lab, however, was on the topmost level of the base, for one. The entire floor was brightly lit and guarded much more closely than the bottom floor had been, and even the second floor lab. The guard's control booth was also in line of sight of the lab door, unlike the other 2 levels. And there were 4 scientists in this lab rather than 3, increasing the chances one wasn't in the lab and would spot her coming in. Well, she'd wanted a way to burn off some of her anger, and if she worked quickly enough, no one would remember being attacked. The challenge will be to do this in such a way she doesn't get all 6 of them piled on at once. Not that she can't handle those sorts of odds, but Jarvis had warned her the labs had stuff that could be weaponized in them. If there was one thing she learned over the years, it was to never, ever, under any circumstances, back any sort of geek against a wall. They might look all soft and squishy and easily beaten. They even usually were on a purely physical, personal level. But they more than made up for that by being able to slap stuff together that could level entire cities if they got cornered. The Iron Man suit being a perfect case in point. So she really needed to not alert the scientists to there being a problem. It would give them time to throw something together that at best would make the rest of her night miserable. She tucked herself around the corner out of sight of the guard control booth and waited for the second guard to make his next round of the floor. There were no convenient pipes or the like on the ceiling to cling to, and while there were doors, she did not trust them to remain out of use for even the length of time she needed. That said, one of the doors was an airlock, like on the lab. It was the disposal room for all the lab waste, and had a wider than average frame around it. Not ideal for perching, but it would get her out of the immediate line of sight, as people rarely thought to look up. The guard was almost too easy. He goes down here instantly to a throat hold he never saw coming because Natasha dropped down behind him. The second guard was nowhere near as easy. For one, he wasn't making any move to leave his post. Natasha had 2 minutes, 3 at most, before he realized something had gone wrong with his buddy, at which point it was even odds on whether he left his post or sounded an alarm. The first wasn't a problem. The second would be. She came around the corner at a run, flinging 2 knives and 2 of the sleep agent needles. She watched more than slightly incredulous as he ducked them all. Then she almost sighed in pleasure. There was no way in hell an unenhanced human could dodge 4 incoming projectiles, not with the spread Natasha had used. That meant this guy was enhanced. Whether it was serum, a mutation, or something else, she didn't know. She didn't really care either. All she knew was that here, finally, was the fight she needed. The guy came at her silently. Natasha figured he knew his partner was down, and the labs were probably soundproof, making an audible warning useless. If he hit an alert button, there was no immediate sign of it. They met in the middle of the hallway. Even better? This guy was good. Disciplined. Not widow level, but more of a challenge than she usually got. There was a fast flurry of moves and counter-moves, strikes and blocks as they each tried to get the upper hand. It took nearly 3 minutes for her to find an opening and take advantage of it, resulting in her choking him out with her thighs. She hit him with a sleeping agent, but the odds of him waking up before he should were strong. Not to mention he had bruises and such on him that could not be explained by falling asleep at his station. Unless, of course, he had enhanced healing to go with the enhanced reflexes. Still, she hauled him back to the guard station and dumped him in the chair, just in case he stayed asleep long enough and did heal fast. She might get lucky. One thing had gone her way at least. He hadn't hit any sort of alarm, or if he had, Jarvis had diverted it. All 4 scientists were in the room. Unfortunately, they were wide awake and excited in a way she associated with scientists who just had their breakthrough in whatever they were working on. Fortunately for her, none of them had enhanced reflexes, and none of the 4 were able to dodge the needles she threw at them. Once all 4 were down, she got to work, keeping an eye on the door just in case the security guard woke up. Once she was done with the computer, she put all 4 scientists in chairs, then dug around until she found the booze that she knew had to be hiding somewhere in the lab. She never met a scientist who didn't keep a bottle of some sort of alcohol on hand for celebrations. A few glasses, a bit of spilled booze, and dumping most of the rest down the sink in the corner before leaving the bottle behind. And with luck, they'd think they'd partied in response to the breakthrough and fallen asleep over drinks. That done, she got the hell out of Dodge. Fortunately, the guard was still asleep. The others would all sleep for hours. There's a chance they'll realize they've been made, thanks to that guard. But really, Natasha was going to call this one a win.